Alright everyone, here we go. Part 2 of the Cold War intro. So, you've hopefully answered these questions on your Google Docs. Now we're going to go ahead and kind of look at a few more of the kind of main ideological foundations of the war, early events, and kind of pivotal points. So, let's go ahead and get started. Get this. There we go. Alright. So, one of the first major events is the Berlin Crisis, which occurs from June of 48 to May of 49. So, if you guys remember, we briefly touched upon this at the end of World War II, but once Germany was invaded, it was divided into 4 parts. Okay, there were the 3 western parts, being the French zone, the British zone, and the American zone, and then there was the eastern part being the Soviet zone. Okay, the 3 western parts would later become West Germany, and the eastern part would become East Germany. Now, the western parts were growing in prosperity due to the Marshall Plan, which at this point had already been implemented by the US. Okay. Stalin wanted to gain control of West Berlin. West Berlin, despite being controlled by the Western nations, the Allies, was actually in Eastern Germany. Let me get a map up here. Give me a second. All right, here we go. So as you can see, World War II ends, and it's divided. Germany's divided into 4 parts. Right, we've got the British side, the American side, the French side. This is the Soviet side, the red one. However, deep within the Soviet side is the capital, Berlin, which was also divided in a very similar fashion. This later became West Berlin, East Berlin, and the Berlin Wall will be built along here later on, about 11 more years before that happens. Okay, so Stalin wanted to gain control of West Berlin. Right? If he had control over all Berlin, he would have control over the whole capital of Germany. So it would be a very kind of important, symbolic control piece for Stalin. So what he does is he basically cuts all links with West Germany. Okay, all of the roads leading to West Berlin were cut off, so no more supplies could get in. So essentially he's trying to starve the people of West Berlin into submission. What the US does is it starts to airlift supplies into West Berlin. Okay, here we see an image of that. Now this was a very dangerous situation because the US is flying these planes over East Germany, which was controlled by the Soviets. The Soviets could have decided to shoot down the planes. That would have probably started World War III, right? But again, as we see with the Cold War, is that neither side wanted to start World War III. The problem is, they didn't know that until the end, right? Both sides were firmly under the belief that the other side wanted to start World War III, and it was up to them to stop it. But in reality, neither side wanted to truly go to World War III. In the end, the USSR eventually admitted defeat once they were allowing the planes to get in there, and they lifted the blockade, and West Berlin was able to continue receiving aid from the West. Okay, so again, this is one of those tense moments. This is kind of that brinksmanship idea. It's that support idea, right? We're seeing a lot of these strategies playing out here. Okay, so let's look really briefly at the U.S. and kind of what life was like in the U.S. during the Cold War. We'll go into this more next week, but this is just kind of a broad overview of kind of how the Cold War affected the domestic and foreign policies of the U.S. So let's look at domestic policies first, things that were happening at home. Number one is we have the spread of McCarthyism, okay? We have this Senator McCarthy, who was a very strong proponent of escalating the war. He was constantly talking about how the Soviet Union was going to start World War III, how there were Soviet spies in the U.S. government. Famously, he did this thing where he kind of held up this piece of paper and basically said, I have on this list, or on this paper, a list of 200 Americans who are actually Soviet spies in the U.S. government. Basically kind of created this widespread paranoia. And then this in turn led to the government kind of invading people's rights and privacy to figure out if they were actual Soviet spies. In fact, most people weren't, okay? But there was this kind of widespread fear and paranoia. Kind of think about kind of the post-9/11 world, right? After the attacks on the Twin Towers, there was this kind of huge fear of terrorism, which led to a lot of kind of diminishing of privacy rights and individual rights in order to kind of supposedly keep people safer. McCarthyism is kind of a similar idea to that. Okay, we have the creation of the HWAC, or the House Un-American Activities Committee, which is basically a committee in the House whose job it was to kind of figure out if there are any un-American activities happening. But this kind of went along with McCarthyism. Any sort of people who were supposedly doing something that could make them, guilty or at least suspicious, right? Maybe they were reading a book on the Soviet Union. Maybe they were wearing a lot of red. Maybe their neighbor overheard them talking about how Joe Stalin's a great guy. They could be investigated by the WHAC. Loyalty oaths. Many members of the government and other industries were forced to take loyalty oaths to the United States. Essentially, what's happening here is their loyalty is being questioned by the government. That's kind of the main point here. Blacklists. Certain industries had blacklists. People who were accused of being Soviet spies or Soviet sympathizers were put on blacklists. So the most famous one being the Hollywood blacklist. We had these various Hollywood actors that, based on their movies or things they said, were accused of being supporters of the Soviet Union and communism, and basically they were blacklisted from any movies. No movie studio would hire them or put them in their movies. And so we have this very big impact as well. And then we have bomb shelters. A lot of people who had money built bomb shelters in case there was a nuclear war. So kind of like nowadays, people are all freaking out and hoarding toilet paper. People were doing that in the 1950s as well, where they were constantly on the edge of nuclear war, and so they started to stockpile canned food and water and toilet paper and all that stuff, and build these actual underground bomb shelters where they and their families could be safe in the case of a nuclear war. Foreign policies. Well, we have the Korean War, which again we'll get into next week, but we have basically the U.S. supporting one side, South Korea, the Soviets supporting the other side, North Korea. We have the arms race and the space race, basically a constant race to who could build the bigger, stronger weapons, who could build up more weapons, and then who could reach space first. We'll talk about that in a second here. The Truman Doctrine, which we already talked about, kind of this idea that, hey, we're going to go in and stop the spread of communism. And then the Eisenhower Doctrine, which was about kind of, again, on a worldwide scale, stopping the spread of communism and sending support to nations that are struggling to find freedom, but to find freedom from communism. Okay, so like I said earlier, we have two major treaties or alliances. On the western side, we have NATO, which is still with us today, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, created in 1949. Here we see all the various nations and when they joined. And then the Soviets countered with the Warsaw Pact in 1955, and here we see the map of that and the nations that were a part of the Warsaw Pact. So now the lines have been drawn. We have the two major players, NATO against the Warsaw Pact, democracy and capitalism versus communism and socialism. So how do we see that play out? Well, we have the arms race, which I mentioned earlier, which is a very important part of the Cold War. Tensions really increased a lot in 1949 when the USSR exploded its first atomic bomb. Before this, only the US had nuclear weapons. So the idea was, well, if we have them, we're safe, because they can't use them against us. Well, the Soviets were able to make their own in 1949. 1952, the U.S. exploded the first hydrogen bomb, which was 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. So again, here we see this, both sides trying to develop these weapons, and then them trying to one-up each other by building bigger and bigger, more powerful weapons, and also more weapons. By the end of the Cold War, both sides had thousands of nuclear weapons, and had World War III started, it would have truly been the end of the world as we knew it. We also have the space race. The big thing here with the space race was viewed not only as kind of a test of both sides' technological prowess, right? Who could get to space first as a kind of, a feather in their cap, but also about the ability to use these space-going technologies to launch weapons. Okay, so the USSR was the first to launch something into orbit. They launched Sputnik, the first satellite launched into orbit, in 1957. The US lost the first round of the space race, so Sputnik was launched. This led to a lot of paranoia in the US because the idea was, hey, if they can launch something into space, they can probably launch a missile at us as well. Okay, in 1961, Yuri Gagarin, Soviet, became the first human in space and the first to orbit Earth. Christ. This led to kind of, again, this fear in the U.S., right? They were like, we lost round 2. We lost round 1. We lost round 2. We need to do something. And so Kennedy, who at this point was president, basically gave a speech saying, hey, we're going to be the first to land a man on the moon. and we're going to have him return safely by the end of the decade. The Soviets were also the first to get any living being in space. They sent a dog up there, Laika, the space dog, but the dog did not survive. The Soviets and dogs don't have a great track record, as if you guys remember from World War II. Their ideas about using dogs for war are not really the most humanitarian, I guess. And then Apollo 11 finally landed on the moon in July 16th of 1969. And this was kind of the big, all right, now we're winning the space race for the U.S. But again, this was kind of a way for both sides to really kind of try to one-up each other and defeat each other, right? Both in building bigger weapons and getting to space first. All right, so now we're done. What I'd like you guys to do, there's going to be an activity, an assignment also, but for the lecture, what I'd like you guys to do is just define you don't have to illustrate because it's kind of hard to do drawings, but define the following ideas: containment, McCarthyism, WHAC, the Truman Doctrine, the Eisenhower Doctrine, proxy wars, and the Marshall Plan. Okay, you can use this lecture, you can also look them up online if you want to get more information, but just 2 to 3 sentences for each one, just kind of define them, what they are, why they're important, and that's about it. Then you'll open up Google Classroom again, you'll find the other assignment for today, complete that, and you're done. Alright, hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll catch you next week.